Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Fatigue Files. I'm delighted to have with me today Athene Knufer, who works as a neuroscientist, a former neuroscience researcher, I believe, Athene.
Yeah.
Now they're doing somatic practice, working generally in the field that we call mind body. And we might even to get into that whole terminology because, the hyphenation is itself an interesting area to discuss. So, Athene, welcome. It's just lovely to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Anna. And it's lovely to come back together in this way.
Yeah, it is delicious. Do you want to tell people about the interesting kind of move from neuroscience research into working with somatic embodied practice?
Yeah. I would love to. So, as you well know, I was a very hardworking neuroscientist at the time where I, developed quite complex symptoms of chronic illness, whatever term one might prefer to use here, chronic wellness, adaptation to what was happening in my life. Yeah. And I mean, it was a very radical change in that I had been working at the bench, for many years, doing my PhD. And at the time, I was doing a postdoctoral research position at the University of Cambridge, working on neuroplasticity in development and early development, embryonic development. Um, and yeah, it was the pandemic and COVID happened. We were one of the first labs who were allowed to work at the bench again. And we were talking about this thing called long COVID, and we were talking about, the different complexities of chronic illness that we were hearing about. And I just remember thinking, God, I would hate to develop something like that. And at the time, I had actually newly developed chronic pain. And I was starting to learn, perhaps for the very first time, what some of my neuroscientific learnings actually meant on an embodied level, because I was starting to learn a little bit about, pain neuroscience as it applied to my personal journey. But there was still, a real resistance, I think, to fully integrating that. Um, and I was, I think, pretty obsessive about, finding any bit of damage that might have been done to my various joints and things like that. Not to say that that's not also an important piece, but yeah, there was this transition period of like really contextualizing the things that I was learning about and researching with my own bodily experience. And eventually, those things gained momentum and I developed many other symptoms. I myself became bedbound for a time, about a year. And when I was bedbound, I did not work at the bench, at least. um, and it put me into a bit of a space to do a lot of contemplation, right? About life, about who I was, what's my identity beyond being an academic, beyond being a neuroscientist. And at the same time, I did have a lot of knowledge. And, I knew about neuroplasticity, the nervous system's uh, ability to change and shift. And that obviously also extends to other bodily systems as well. And with that in mind, even though there wasn't necessarily at the time, I think, a clear blueprint for me to follow that would lead to a guaranteed recovery, I just thought back to my bachelor's lectures and all of the different conditions that, are treated with a kind of neuroplastic approach. And I was just kind of a bit, you know, emboldened, I guess, in my quest for recovering, you know, take it what it may. And in the process of my own recovery, I also felt like I wanted to dig deeper into embodiment. I was terrified of being in my body at the time. And also, I will admit that when I was a bachelor's student, a lot of the people I knew in neuroscientific like research circles kind of really like turn their nose up at like embodied neuroscience or like embodied psychology. It was a bit of a niche area that was seen to be a little bit yeah, I would say that it wasn't fully taken seriously. That might have also been, you know, due to some of the specific research that was being done. But I always think back to those times because it did really reek of, you know, this Cartesian dualism of just like the mind and body being very separate and the nervous system being the holy grain, but the nervous system as we understand it being, I think, very cognitive, you know, cognitive, maybe perceptual, but yeah, that's the sort of realm where the focus lied. And yeah, I essentially, you know, went deeper into embodiment practices because I realized that my knowledge did help me to some degree. But if I wanted to kind of walk out, literally walk out, right, of my front door, I needed something different. And yeah, kind of long story short, I did manage to walk out of the door. And in the process of wanting to go deeper, started to also train in different modalities. First and foremost, actually, because I wanted to learn more, I wanted to go deeper into my own practice. And I thought that I might take this kind of embodiment lens to some other type of work at some point. But then, and I was actually very clear, I don't want to work with people who are recovering from various symptoms when I'm done with this. You know, and done with this in apostrophes. But that is the path that I ended up taking because it just happened, and it happened in a way that I realized that I actually very much enjoy it. And a few people, my first few clients who came to work with me also, I think, wanted to work with me because I did have a neuroscience angle and because I did have some scientific literacy that they valued. And I think it was really down to trust because, you know, even a few years later, I think there is a lot more trust in somatic practice or a lot more trust in different modalities that work with the nervous system and the body than there maybe was a few years ago. But people were wanting to take that leap. And so having someone that could maybe, also explain some of the things that are also happening in the nervous system alongside, you know, guiding them in somatic practice was helpful. And yeah, I guess I still do bring that lens to my work, but I would say that I'm not overly oriented to bringing people into the depths of the scientific detail, because sometimes that's not actually what is necessary for transformation. I think it can be a very helpful framework. And for those people who are really, really interested and geeky and want to get geeky about it, I'm very happy to, humor that. But I think the transformation is actually often happening in being present with the body.
Yeah, it's really interesting because obviously we're never anything but embodied.
Right.
Right. So it's an interesting dilemma, isn't it, when we say getting into the body? So it might be good to open out what we actually mean by that. So in terms of how you experience that and how you conceptualize it, given that we are always intrinsically material, always intrinsically inescapably embodied, what's the disconnect? Where do you see it coming from? Is it kind of sociocultural, philosophical inheritance, you know, the kind of academic leaning towards the brain as CEO. I keep hearing people talk about the body and the brain as if the brain's not part of the body. And it's really, really interesting the way that we conceptualize and segregate. So where's it come from? And also with when you approached it yourself, Athena, and when you're working with clients, how do you then invite practices that re-emerge the inherent embodied nature of intelligences, multiple, and the way that we can transform and heal in a kind of reflexive, self-relating way? So two sides to that question. One, where's the disconnect? How do you see it? And also then, like, how do you invite those practices of, call it re-embodiment, even though we know that we never actually left our bodies?
Right. Yes. I will answer both aspects of the question, but I really appreciate that. And that is actually almost like a bit of a tease of how I do work with people, right? Is that the body is not a scary place because you're already in it. And we can basically connect with the body in very organic ways, in ways that are already happening. Sometimes it's just noticing things that are already happening. But to kind of answer your questions consecutively, I do want to say a little bit about where the disconnect is. And, I do think that philosophical frameworks are part of it, and certainly we all know that Western medicine is very much like we have these separate systems, and the mind does this and the body does that, and the body has the cardiovascular system, and then we've got the digestive system, and there isn't much by way of trying to integrate these pieces together. We see that reflected when people arrive with more than 10 diagnoses that all happened at the same time, and no cross reference between clinicians in terms of treating the person, the body as a whole, right? But for me, I also think that it is very intrinsically linked to like a culture of dominance and patriarchy, and really mind over body, not just mind as separate from body, but the body as being like a site of shame or a site of bad things.
Messiness, leaky, messy, lack of boundaries, yada yada.
Yeah.
Particularly associated with the female, right? Historically.
Yeah, 100%. And ultimately, and this is maybe my perspective on things, I think that it has really benefited patriarchy. It has very, very much benefited capitalism for people to feel like they are not in their bodies, right? Even though, like you've helpfully pointed out, we already are. Or to see very normal bodily responses or protective mechanisms as something that is bad or shouldn't be happening, and we need to change that or regulate that. One of the earliest things that I did in my own recovery was to allow myself to just go to the toilet when I needed to go, and become really mindful of like needing to go to the toilet and actually being like, okay, so I'm gonna go and do that now, right? Just like these or like I need a sip of water, these very elemental things that we do have capacity for in general from the beginning, but very much get restricted actually in society. That's just a very simple example of where we can already become divorced from our bodies, right? Or
I think what I'm hearing you say as you say that is you're kind of going against a kind of sublimation that we learn, because those signals would always be there. And linking it to what you were saying about patriarchy, dominance, hierarchy, that whole idea of mind over matter, as you say, the intrinsic dominance of that, means that there's this kind of commitment to a rationality and a willfulness, a forward movingness, a linearity that denies or sublimates what gets in the way of that progress, inverted commas, right? Even the progress narrative civilizationally in terms of colonialism and all that. And so the kind of psychologization or the distributive impact of that is to teach people to ignore signals coming from the distributed intelligence of their own materiality. And what I'm hearing you say in this sense of elemental return is you started to just say, what am I not noticing that's happening right now that's communicative from the wider distributed intelligence of this system? Right? Is that, would you say that's a fair frame?
I think that's a fair frame. And I also want to add to that, though, that, you know, the signals are there, but if we learn for enough time not to pay attention to them, they can be muted and we can dissociate quite heavily from our bodies. In fact, I think, you know, we all do to some degree, and our society is very much developing in a way where that is probably being heightened by, you know, technology use in everyday life as well. So there are signals and we're not noticing them, but we think we are also more readily being pulled out of our bodies in terms of attentional mechanisms too.
Right. So is that distraction is that distraction for the reticular activating system, or is there something as well besides kind of reticular activating system attentional mechanisms? Do you think
attentional mechanisms? But I also think that the way that we start to process our bodily like signals, for example, like the insula is very heavily involved with that, also changes.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that we can't have, you know, change. I'm going to call it for the better in this term, because I suppose that I do have the position that being more aware of our bodily signals is overall not just important, but like
good,
essential for health.
Yes,
let's just say it's good.
I agree. So what I'm, as someone who's interested in new materialist thinking there, what I'm hearing is that materiality is agentic. It changes in response to a multitude of inputs, some of which are our attentional habits, some of which are environmental. And really what we're talking about is distributed plasticity. So when we're talking about neuroplasticity here, we're really talking about the learning capacity, the plasticity of the whole embodied system, right? Not just a kind of narrow brain-based thing, but a wider set of signals.
Yeah, 100%. And, you know, obviously I am a neuroscientist, so I will talk about the nervous system a lot, but I do really appreciate also this term of bioplasticity, right? Because there is more to our body than just the nervous system. And if anyone has ever looked at the nervous system, you'll see all of the different places it goes and all the different systems it's interconnected with, right? And that is essentially what a body is. It's a lot of different interconnected systems. And, you know, we both know about the condition MECFS, which is also always classed as a neuroimmune condition. And that's an actually very exciting area of research where there are people that are now coming to see, oh, actually, there are these two systems that are talking to each other. And in the scope of biology, that is, you know, for us, that's probably, well, that's not a surprise. But in terms of research, that's actually, you know, a forward step that there is even a field where people are like, let's look at how these two systems intersect with each other. It shouldn't be revolutionary. But where research has been, it kind of is. And it's also where things start to get messy, right? And so people do like to veer away from it because it's more complex.
Yeah, it's more complex, and yet our siloing in academia, you know, we do it in terms of disciplines.
Yeah.
You know, we cut law off sometimes from politics, even though it's intrinsically political. It's always interwoven with economics, the underlying commitments of liberalism, capitalism, all these things are in play, and we silo these things out and study them separately unless we're critical scholars who are raging across disciplinary boundaries in transdisciplinary explorations. But we've done a similar thing there with the body. That's why I was chuckling when you said about the two systems speaking to each other. Like, why wouldn't they be? It's one communicative, is this not obvious?
Well, I completely agree, right? And at the same time, it's also real to say there's a huge gap between what is painfully obvious and what's actually being done in research.
Yes.
And you're very right about the siloing, trying to do anything interdisciplinary, as it would be called, because you're looking at more than one system, is a big challenge in academia when it comes to funding, when it comes to trying to get people on board with your ideas. And I'm kind of back in this field of control and domination. Like, we love to put things into specific boxes. And the body just doesn't comply with that.
Yeah. And I think it'd be really cool at this moment, because we're getting, as academics, I'm leading us into that. This lands for people, right, in really powerfully important ways. What concerns me here is that the framings themselves can become forms of injustice and suffering. So if I'm taught, for example, that the answer to a complex multi-system response, such as MECFS, is one particular kind of approach. Let's say if I'm told that brain retraining alone is the answer, and I don't get the expected outcome, and at every stage there's a construct here, something's being constructed, I can, and I meet clients who do this all the time, label myself as a problem. And I can suffer as a result of a sense of inadequacy, but it's not me necessarily, it's the framing. And that's why what we're talking about, I think, really lands and matters for people, because these framings that fail to take into account the full complexity of what's actually happening, set people up for years of perceived failure and definite suffering.
I agree with you.
We spoke, didn't we, a bit about that gap between the kind of frameworks and the lived experience. You were talking about the gap between the neuroscience research and the lived experience of embodiment. Maybe we could look at that, tease that out a bit more, Athena, at this point, because I think it's really relevant to this point of where this lands in people's lives in terms of how do these frameworks constrain what's possible for people? How do the framings themselves become a form of moral injury?
I mean, I think this is a great topic, and also a difficult one, right? Because we start to get into territory where there has been a lot of harm and suffering as a result of inadequate systems. And for many people, that starts in their GP's office, right? Or working with different specialists, all of whom have a very, very narrow view or no view in many cases on the complexity and the person actually just sitting in front of them who is looking for guidance and support. And eventually, when all of those sort of avenues have been exhausted, there might be some willingness to look beyond what is offered through these primary care routes. And then we encounter very similar constraints in terms of the frameworks there as well. And, I think we're back in like territory of capitalism and dominance over the body and patriarchy. Like, let's regulate out of this. Let's, do this protocol and you will be absolutely fine. And I think people are, when they are in suffering, very, very vulnerable. Not that they don't have agency and power. Of course, we know that too. But there is a failing of these systems and the people working within these systems too, in really bringing like care to people that is broad enough, but also contained enough to really support people where they're at. within their unique life circumstances. And there simply is not one way to recover. I think if we look at all the different people who do recover, sure, can we find some principles? Can we find some overlaps? Absolutely. But it's very, very important to actually say that these narrow definitions, these narrow treatment protocols or frameworks actually put people into a very unhealthy focus on a holy grail or a kind of magic bullet. And I think this actually tends to tap into, much deeper wounding as well for people.
Yeah. And also the fact, I mean, for me, and you might disagree with me, and you're very welcome to, but where I've got to on this now is I see this as so multi-layered, and I read embodied communication as in symptoms as intelligent. They're modes of intelligent communication. They're not necessarily, even the language of dysfunction bothers me, because actually what we're talking about is a highly functional response to a mismatch between what a body requires in terms of its deep time evolutionary intelligence and what it's being confronted with in day-to-day life. So when we talk even about nervous system, I mean, obviously the emphasis on regulation, of course we want to be flexible. Doesn't mean we always need to be calm, right? We want to be able to be activated when it's appropriate. We want that agentic flexibility, a capaciousness, yes, the capacity to hold discomfort, to process discomfort, and a wisdom, coming back to this interoceptive attunement, this sensing of the body, this sensing of the intelligence, the ability to understand, yes, it's a flawed guru because sometimes it does get stuck in loops, but equally the fact that it's communicating in that way means something, and we can learn enough to engage with it intelligently. But for me, the fundamental problem is this mismatch between the multiple layers of this incredible intelligence that we are and modern contemporary conditions. So talking even just about the nervous system for a moment, I know that if I get up to daylight and expose my suprachiasmatic nucleus and skin to sunlight at a certain time, that sends a signal to my nervous system, this much elevated, shibboleth in some quarters. I don't necessarily need to be doing deep breathing exercises and mantras and all the rest of it, helpful as those are. It is a necessary but not sufficient condition, perhaps, for me to work if I've got a nervous system that leans in one direction too much in terms of there's not adequate flexibility in its range. I don't want to say dysregulated because I don't actually think it is.
I hate that word.
It's not dysregulated. Go on, please say more about that, please. I want to hear.
I mean, it probably honestly took me a little bit of time to have the sort of critical lens of it in the way that I do now, right? We all start somewhere. I think partially just because I was so excited by the fact that I could do something with my body and my nervous system, right? And it didn't occur to me straight away that this word regulate also comes with a form of control, or it can do at the very least. I was recently reflecting on, this time 4 years ago where I had just essentially, been brain retraining, as people call it, and sort of left post-exertional malaise behind. And at the time I would have said, it was the nervous system regulation, it was the brain retraining. But actually what was happening was that I had, through various means, accessed enough of a felt sense of inner and outer safety that made it possible for my body to have capacity to walk again, for example, without, some form of, payback afterwards. And I really dislike this word dysregulation because it's sort of a value judgment, right? It's oh, your nervous system is doing this, it's not a million miles away from saying that's bad, or it shouldn't be doing this, or it's faulty. And so again, we're in the territory of thinking of the body as something that has to be fixed. Whereas, like you say, we have deep evolutionary history. A lot of our essential bodily functions are, connected to very evolutionary ancient parts of our nervous system also.
They're still alive, present now, right, Athena? Their
Yeah, we're still
evolution
animals,
is,
right?
it's there now. Like my mitochondria are millennia older than even a body form, right? And they, in this present day, Anna, mitochondrial evolutionary intelligence is at work all the time. So evolution's not a past thing. It's not back there. It is also back there, but it's now, right?
Right, of course. And I mean, when we get into evolution, we're always looking at time scales, and I think people think of it as like, okay, we see these big measurable changes over very, very long time scales. What about the adaptability and the change that is happening within one organism and within its lifetime, right? Yeah, I'm with you on that. So I'm also with you as seeing symptoms as intelligence and as messages. And I think, again, it took some time to understand that what was happening was a sort of invitation to look at my life and to look at how I related to my person, to my body, and to sort of really connect that with the symptoms themselves are not wrong. And they're not a sign of having done something wrong. I'm very interested in early development also, and the ways that our early experiences sort of shape our bodies and our nervous systems. And I really think that a lot of the time when we're approaching the body and symptoms from this lens of regulation or regulating the dysregulated, we are doing this from a place that is still telling ourselves in a way, or communicating in some way, that we're not good enough, or that our body is not good enough. And I think that's a really important thing to uncover when it is present for people, which it often is, in my experience.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, isn't it? Because obviously there are optimal modes of function. Yeah. And it makes sense to think about
support that.
What tends to well-being, like
sure.
A body that's producing sufficient energy, that is, flexible, strong, grounded, all that. But absolutely. And the interesting thing about this more somatic approach, of course, is that the body keeps performing those patterns. So I might have a stuck fascia pattern that's carrying a specific association to a specific time in my life that I can either access through, it's a kind of network gestalt, isn't it? I could access it maybe through working with the original prediction, or I could access it directly through the fascia and actually, somatically unlock a pattern that I've been running unconsciously. I love the fact that it's so distributed and there are so many different ways in. But I'd love to talk to you in particular, Athena, about the whole idea of prediction error, because the whole system runs on prediction, right? And it's the body that feeds back the mismatch between what the brain expects. The mismatch comes from somatic information. And it seems to me that all successful therapeutic change in one way or another manages to disrupt an existing pattern to produce enough flexibility and choice for a more agentic, choiceful pattern of an alternative. In a sense, it doesn't matter which alternative, but because what you're doing is you're unsticking a counterproductive pattern. So I want to talk to you about this because I know you're a neuroscientist. And I'd love you to really get into memory reconsolidation for anyone who hasn't come across it, how important it is, and also how distributed it is. It's not just a brain thing, although we talk about it in brain terms and it happens in the brain, but how that works somatically as well. I'd love you to open that up if you're up for it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so as you already said, with prediction error, we might, for example, already be able to interpret a signal that is coming from the body as pain because there is a prediction that that is the information that will be received before the body even has a chance to really make itself known, right? And there's a lot of talk about, for example, the vagus nerve, right? It gets a lot of attention, and how we have all of this input coming from the body. And I'm not going to go on and on about the vagus nerve because it's just one nerve, but I do think it is really important to know that when we are receiving feedback from the body, our nervous system can already, or our brain in this case, can already have a lot of different shapings that influence how that signal is perceived in terms of, for example, sensation. And we do think about this a lot in terms of pain, and there certainly the neuroscience is most established at showing this at different levels of physiology. But I think it's also very apparent that this very much translates to other somatic experiences also, where there is a lot of complexity, right? And this mismatch, however, between maybe there is normal neutral information coming from the body, maybe even safe information, right? And there being a sort of top-down prediction in this case that is coming through a lens of lack of safety, is one that we can really work with, like you said, therapeutically. And there are lots of different ways to do this, but the way that the nervous system essentially updates its predictions is through really showing it this mismatch on an experiential level, right? And so a simple example of that would be to learn to attend to sensations that are very much probably shouting at you and that make you feel like you're in terrible danger with slightly more neutrality than yesterday, or a safe presence at the same time. And that safe presence might come through the therapist sitting in front of you who is smiling at you warmly, or a touch of a hand, right? A safe presence along with a signal of danger. You talked about memory reconsolidation. And so there we're really thinking about that there's actually a re-experiencing that can happen for people of certain embodied memories. So we're not just talking a visual scene, but a happening in the whole body, that there was something about the situation now that is making our whole body re-experience something from the past, which may be colored, right? Which may be challenging, traumatic even. And it's not actually what is maybe playing out in the present though, right? But our bodies are so rich that we wouldn't even necessarily be aware of that re-experiencing of the past in the present moment. We will just see that it's the present moment, and the present moment feels very bad in lots of ways. And memory reconsolidation will very much work with this mismatch again of trying to update predictions and trying to experience the present moment with more safety, usually in a slightly different way. And that can sometimes entail also working with past material with an embodied safe presence in the now too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're at, on in very simple terms dealing with this mismatch between safety and danger quite a lot of the time. And of course, those are spectra too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting as well because with kind of hypnotic work, I
Yeah.
work with a kind of very reduced efficient form of memory reconsolidation that I think it was John Overdurf and Melissa Tears called the meta pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And the basic idea is that there's an original association. So, you know, say you're 2 and you have an experience, and what you remember is a particular facial expression, which when you're 30 and your partner looks at you a certain way with that particular expression, you suddenly get the kinesthetic flooding of the original experience, right?
Yeah.
And the way that the mismatch is generated is you'll get the client to identify the precise trigger. So you get them to imagine time slowing down, and you
Yeah.
get very, very precise. So it's not just, oh, daddy was angry. It's like that precise moment. It was when he frowned. That was the moment that it happened, because that's when my partner frowned. And then you kind of step away from that with a pattern interruption, a shift into a different state. And it can be laughing, it can be anything, get different neurotransmitter tides and, you know, energies on board. And then you find any really powerful positive kinesthetic, it doesn't matter what it is, and you take it to the original trigger, and you just do that a few times. And then the original connection collapses. And what I love about that is the way that it's all stored in kind of networked gestalts.
Yeah.
So if I can get maybe 8 contemporary examples where that reactivation occurred, I don't actually need to find out what happened when the person was 2 necessarily, right?
Yeah.
Although it's fun to do it because we're meaning makers and we love stories and we kind of want to know, right?
And there's a place for that too, right?
Totally. Yeah, totally. Because then you can have that self-understanding of the archaeology of your own journey, which can really, really help you in terms of being more agentic now. Because I'm always
I
interested,
agree.
and I'm sure you are as well. I'm always interested in how and why is this a problem? Why is this being constructed or experienced as a problem in the now? That's
Yeah.
always the interest. And how can this become not a problem in the now, so that it's got 50 million opportunities to be anything else that might be what you actually want more, you know?
Yeah.
So it's beautiful work.
It is beautiful work. And I've got to say that the most simple way in which uh, I work, you know, with clients, but also in my everyday life is real mindfulness. And I'm not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily just talking about silent meditation or like a meditation with breath, although those can be beautiful components as well. But for a lot of us, finding enough slowness and attention to the present moment, the things around us, uh, this like small amount of slowing can sometimes be enough to already elicit lots of little mini mismatches in the present, right? Without deeper therapeutic work. And it
Yes.
can make people more aware of their thought patterns or of the safety and joy around them, you know?
Yes.
But this process that you just described is, of course, a very potent one. And I think there are a number of therapies that I'm gaining more and more interest in that really work with, you know, deep brain kind of reprocessing with the midbrain, for example, where we go into networks that we don't fully understand yet, but we just work with the nervous systems and body's natural ability to integrate information and update and
Mm.
yeah, be more present in our lives and be more agentic,
I
right? Like
love I love
that's what
that
it comes
link.
down to.
I love that link you're making between being in the present moment
Yeah.
and the agentic, because there's something about being in the present moment that where you bring your full attention, right? As you said, even to the little things that are the mini mismatches,
Yeah.
but being fully attentive in the present moment
Yeah.
means that I've got potentially a wider scope of awareness in terms of
Yeah.
what's actually real, what's actually here in this
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah.
whenever someone has a problem or a trauma response or a trigger, it's coming from a narrowed conviction. It's coming from a constricted pattern. It's coming from a contraction that becomes a kind of certainty for the system that keeps reperforming it. And so coming into the present moment and by definition introducing an awareness of many other things is kind of going peripheral in a somatic sense. It's opening a field, right? It opens up. And so by definition, the minute you open up, you're already making new connections, whether you're conscious of it or not, 95 to 98% more than conscious in our functioning. And so that's all working incredibly. And I think it's rather beautiful here how traditional spirituality comes together with these much more contemporary modes of healing and this whole dynamic of becoming more fully present. And in everything you said, I've sensed this beautiful thread of a kind of homecomingness, to embodied materiality, a kind of homecomingness to self, a kind of homecomingness to a sense of safety and at homeness in the world, whether it's in a room naming objects or whether it's moving through space.
Yeah.
There's a kind of homecomingness in what you're saying. Oh.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a journey of coming home. And it's also, I think, quite radical to do that. It's to be agentic in our decisions and be present and agentic in our lives is reclaiming in a way something that was always ours within a society and a system that, like I said, and we've spoken about very early on in this conversation, is really trying for that to not be the case for individuals, right?
Yeah.
And so with that, I think also comes that there has to be an acknowledgement of, all of the systemic factors that do make it harder for us to access these moments. Like there can't be a denial of all of the ways that we are influenced by our external environment. And there is danger and threat and lots of terrible things happening. And we can hold that, ideally, when we develop the capacity, along with, the joy and the safety that is there, and our body's capacity to sense that and to sense support both within and without.
Yeah,
because that is where we can stay flexible. That's where we can stay, moving towards our values and doing things that matter to us.
I love that. And I also love in that the awareness of structural conditions.
Yeah.
Because often in recovery communities, this is so individualized. It's treated as an individual, an individual issue, and how I heal is thoroughly individual, blah, blah, blah. But these illnesses and these conditions and these kind of struggles that people have are not evenly distributed. They land in some communities and on some bodies more than they do on others. And it's all intrinsically tied up with the political moment we're in. You've just I think you've implied it in what you said, where we're at this kind of inflection point between what I would call contractive energies of control and hierarchy and more expansive energies of plasticity, fluidity, and inclusion. And I think it's really vital. And I think it's not really spoken about enough in the recovery. I'm going to call it an industry because it is.
It is an industry. I would agree.
And that's part of the problem I have with it. But that whole way of thinking about, even functional stuff, but beyond the functional into kind of the recovery programs and stuff out there. Some of them are excellent. Some of them are a bit more limited. But there is a fundamental failure often to think about the systemic pressures on people and to think about the kind of externalities that people cannot ultimately control. They can exercise forms of agency within those conditions. I can do what I can within my economic and physical means to offset some of the structural dynamics. But our healing has to be collective as well. And the work that, the work that you're doing, the work that I do, the thinking we're doing, the engagement we're doing, I think has collective implications. And that if there's one thing I would want to say to our whole community, it would be start to think about the collective structural dimensions of this more. It's not just individualized, and it's not just about coming home to a sense of individual safety. It's about how do we, as a human species, as a collective, as earthlings, as critters, how do we come to a kind of homecoming? How do we, as Ramdas might put it, how do we walk each other home? I know he's using it in different contexts with a different meaning, but there's something there. And I love the fact that you brought that in.
Yeah, it's very important to me. And to be honest, it's something that just didn't sit well with me when I was very much in the depths of my own recovery journey, was how much you would hear this advice thrown around to just ignore, all the things that are happening in the world and just focus on yourself at the moment. I'm not saying that there aren't times where we might really need to carefully consider our capacity for various things and input. And at the same time, there was something very wrong about that guidance for me on a personal level. I never felt actually seen as a person in that, because I, as a person, have always cared about, the people around me and the systems and like humans, right? And the funny thing is that you kind of alluded to the fact that these types of conditions kind of fall on some people more than others. I would say that as a population, there are in fact a lot of people who really care about humans within that same demographic. And so to ask them to essentially ignore the collective, which I've seen happen more times than I can count. I have clients come to me all the time saying, I'm feeling this grief about what's happening in Palestine, or I'm feeling, really sad about the fact that everyone is so lonely and I don't have a means to help. Should I just ignore that? Should I just try and stay away from it? They're asking these questions, and I just see it actually contracting and disconnecting them a lot of the time. And one of the things that we learn over and over is that we do often have a bit of resource even when we thought that we didn't have some, or we do have a little bit of capacity there. That doesn't mean that we don't need to learn boundaries or our limits. In fact, that's a very, very important piece for a lot of us in recovery. And at the same time, it's always and, right? Not but, it's and. We do have capacity to care about the collective. And when in this industry there are solutions presented to people to, recover, a lot of the time it's not just happening with a narrow framework, it's happening for certain people but not others, or without actually even addressing very real lived realities for people. And that's just something that I've taken issue with in my time in this space. And I think more people need to talk about the fact that without your basic needs met, it is harder. Sure, we can always find that little bit of agency, and that's often what we have to do to be human, is to learn what it means to suffer, right? I very much lean on Buddhism quite a lot with that. But we can't deny that that's also a mismatch of the wrong kind.
And also it means that collectively, when you come to think about policy formation, for example, we get misdirected sometimes to look into the wrong place, rather than looking more broadly at, say, the economic distribution factors that mean that these things fall unevenly, or on the kind of internalized speed of capitalism that people are driven by. And it's just the dimension that gets a bit lost. And it's interesting though, because if we step back again into kind of the more spiritual sense of like connected consciousness, that there, you know, that we're all radically intra-connected, that we're always intra-relational, whether or not we know that. I have found that people, when they're very severe, they might be bedbound, they might have very little capacity for anything at all. But one thing they've got a capacity for is a kind of inner evolution of the self, a kind of transformation of consciousness, which by definition contributes to the collective. And I think sometimes that's a really powerful thing, because I really feel that some people, when they're severe, they lose their sense of purpose, they lose their sense of place, they lose a sense of being valued for anything at all. And, you know, I know for myself, when I was at my most severe, I was literally trapped in my psyche. That was where I was stuck, and nowhere else to go, right?
Yeah, same.
But as you said, I think you used the word invitation earlier in this conversation. It was, I wouldn't wish it on anyone, let me be clear, but it was invitational, and somehow it became a mode of transformation, which meant that the transformation went very deep into like the layers of self that might otherwise never have been challenged, areas of shadow that might otherwise have been unconsciously acted out in the world. And obviously, I'm not saying I'm fully worked out, no one is, but nevertheless, the invitation here, even if you're severe, when you think about the collective dynamics of this, there's something quite empowering about knowing that the work you're doing in your own psyche, trapped in a bed, is nevertheless part of a greater contribution.
I'm very moved by that, Anna, and I really wholeheartedly agree. I don't think I've heard it framed in that particular way before, and I'm just really appreciating it because it's deeply resonant. I, you know, experienced a similar process of whole personhood transformation in my bedbound severe time, because there was nothing else that I could do. Right. I was also in my psyche, and there are a lot of questions, and there was a lot of processing and a lot of integrating that was being done. And ultimately, I don't know who I would be or where I would be without that period in my life, because it happened and I'm now doing this. Right. Yeah. I'm thinking a little bit of this, I think, comes from Stacey Haynes, who is a sort of politicized somatics practitioner. You know, there's a whole sort of world of people who are working more with, you know, organizations and within activism and kind of using the body in that way. But she, early on in one of the trainings that I've done, talked about somatics as a way to move towards your values. And that really resonated with me, because I didn't just go through that process when I was severe to not be severe, and to just, like, you know, get on with life again and just be totally unconscious in the process, but really to be more of who I am. And that includes caring for the collective, and also thinking about, where do I have agency in the now, not just for myself, but also for other people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's brilliant, because everything we've spoken about is intrinsically relational. The whole body's a relational, complex system of communicating intelligences.
Yeah.
And, you know, society likewise is a whole complex system of communicating intelligences of various kinds, multiple kinds. And there's something rather beautiful about maybe leaving our conversation on this kind of inflection point, where we've been so aware of like the political inflection point and the difference between contraction and expansion, between rigidity and fluidity and plasticity, and just kind of leaving it there invitationally for people to maybe reflect on that, and the more invitational dimensions of this experience that so many of us have been pulled into willy-nilly against our will, but which nevertheless has been so profoundly, transformative. And it would, it's far beyond recovery, isn't it? Recovery kind of implies a going back to something, whereas this is really about radical evolution of the self and becoming more than.
Amen.
Yeah, amen. I'm going to stop the recording, but I want to thank you so much, Athena, for such a wonderful. I've just loved this conversation so much.